Welcome everyone to tonight's talk. My name is Robert Furlan. I'm the President of the English Speaking Union. It's my pleasure to host Marc Hendrickx tonight to talk on a particular issue relevant to the theme of the Australian Heritage Festival, which this year is Unearthed. Marc's talk is part of that festival, sponsored by us. And a special welcome to those of you who have joined us tonight hearing about the event through the Australian Heritage website. The theme of the Heritage Festival is Unearthed, and the purpose of that theme is to reveal the past and unearth narratives and knowledge about our environment. So Marc will tonight reveal his fight on behalf of all Australians to access parts of our natural environment and the awe and wonder that they inspire. Marc Hendrickx is a geologist, an engineer, and a community advocate. He's a keen outdoors enthusiast and has been at the forefront of battling government decisions which ban the public from parts of our national parks and part of our natural heritage. Marc is a member of the Right to Climb advocacy group and is also an active member of his local rural fire brigade. He was awarded the National Emergency Medal for his efforts during the 2019-2020 bushfire season. So we have in our midst someone that we can recognise as a genuine community participant and volunteer, and I guess in that context, a hero. So welcome, Marc. Committed to preserving public access to nature, he's played a pivotal role in fighting to keep all aspects of the national parks open for all Australians. He's written several books. The most recent one, I believe, is A Guide to Climbing Mount Warning, The Fight for Awe and Wonder. And it's an account of the wonders he and many others have experienced climbing the peak of Mount Warning in northern New South Wales. Mount Warning is about 1,100 metres above sea level, and it provides, from its summit, views of the Pacific Ocean, Tweed River Valley, and all of the surrounding forested area. Over the course of the last century or so, during which period there have been climbing tracks to the summit of Mount Warning, it's estimated that nearly 3.5 million Australians and visitors have climbed that mountain to enjoy its spectacular views and the unique natural environment that it provides. Recently, the New South Wales Parks Authority banned entry to parts of the park on the grounds that public access offended some Aboriginal groups. Marc really took issue with that ban, and he's the first person to have been fined for defying the climbing ban on Mount Warning. And that fine took place in April of last year. The English Speaking Union has donated to Marc's fight against that fine that he received and in support of his advocacy campaign for public access to all of our natural environment. And I think I'm proud to say that Marc continues to campaign for national park access for all Australians. So to present his view of Unearthed, the awe and wonder of our natural environment, I'll ask Marc to take a stand. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you, Robert. That was a very glowing introduction. So the theme of this year's festival is Unearthed, and the things that I want to unearth are hidden histories that have been shielded and hidden from the public by official accounts of both Ayers Rock and Mount Warning, and I'll discuss a little bit about the Grampians and Arapiles situation as well at the end of the talk. But there are many more places around the country that are being closed off to the Australian public. The photo down the bottom there shows Mount Gillen in Alice Springs. So Mount Gillen is a summit just outside the township of Alice Springs, and it wasn't really a major tourist attraction. It was an area that was visited by locals within Alice Springs to get away and just get away from the hustle and bustle and the craziness that goes on in Alice Springs. And that was closed off in 2022. And there are countless other examples around the country at the moment where we're running into conflicts between Aboriginal cultural heritage and public access issues. So I'll be talking mainly about Ayers Rock and Mount Warning. As Robert said, I've got a couple of books on those issues, so they're available from Connor Court. I've got these to give you guys. So just to thank you for contributing to the fight, and thank you to the English speaking community for the generous donations that you've made. It significantly helped the fight that we're having in this battle with the bureaucracy across multiple states now. So I want to get straight into Ayers Rock, and I don't know how many of you have actually been to Ayers Rock and perhaps climbed it or walked around it. So this is what it used to be like at the summit. You know, lots of joyful faces, people celebrating that achievement of physically climbing the rock and then engaging with that beautiful natural environment. As a geologist, Ayers Rock's very special to me. So one of the first jobs I had at the Northern Territory Geological Survey was taking the science director of the Mars Pathfinder mission, a guy called Matt Gollenbeck, on a geological tour of Central Australia. And this is the first place we took it. We got off the plane from LA, basically, and then got the plane from Sydney to Ayers Rock. And we, after, you know, despite the jet lag, that's the first thing we did was to take him to the summit of Ayers Rock. And he was just really impressed, one, with the geology and what you can see from the summit. A lot of people say it's just desert, but there's a lot of landforms you can see, and it's a very special place to interpret the geology of Central Australia. So that's what it used to be like, and it's been closed now since October 26, 2019. When it was announced in November of 2017, I immediately started this Right to Climb blog and that mission to try and overturn that ban. That was unsuccessful. We're running into similar problems with the Mount Warning closure. What we find in all these cases are that just about everything parks authorities say about the history of climbing or about public access is essentially a lie. I love this. I read an article at the time for The Australian, and this was a cartoon that Eric Lebec provided for that article, and it's just, you know, just highlighting that basically we've got a Pinocchio tale out there that's misrepresenting the true history of these places. And it's an insult not only to the Australian public, but it's also an insult to Aboriginal culture itself, because what they're doing is manufacturing and creating a modern interpretation of a lot of Aboriginal culture, and that's being used to lock people out. So not only do they lie about that, you know, Ayers Rock, they even lie about the weather. So a lot of people towards the end of the climb were faced with a sign like this, you know, walkers, it's closed to forecast rain, and you look at the sky and there's not a cloud in the sky. So very common, and they used the weather to prevent people from climbing. They used the weather to close the climb down, to manufacture the numbers they were looking for. So as you'll hear in a minute, you know, this key figure of 20%. If there was less than 20% of people climbing, then that was an excuse to close the climb down. So there's three myths about the climb I want to talk about. One of the first ones is related to Aboriginal culture at the rock. And if you went to Ayers Rock any time between the early 2000s, right up to the closure, you were faced with this sign that said, you know, under traditional Arnhem culture, we never climb. And in the 2001 management plan, this was sort of expressed to say that we never climb the rock ourselves. And it's essentially a load of bullshit. As soon as you start looking at the history, you realise that this is a complete lie. So in terms of the history of human occupation of Central Australia, the first evidence we've got are of artefacts and carbon dating in an area north of Ayers Rock around about 25,000 years ago. And this is the group of people who arrived prior to the current inhabitants of the Ayers Rock area. And as I said, that's dated to around about 25,000 years ago. We can date the current beliefs based on the timing of the arrival of dingo in Australia, because the creation myths of the Arnanu include the dingo in their creation myths. So we know that the dingo was there prior to them arriving. So that's around about 4,000 years ago. So, so this idea and concept that we've been here forever isn't quite right. There were multiple phases of human occupation within Central Australia. That first phase, 25,000 years ago, was towards the height of the last ice age. Conditions got worse, and around about 12,000 years ago, at that really height of the last ice age, the dunes that you see from the summit of Ayers Rock were mobile. There were mobile sand dunes running through, so it was a true desert environment, and it would have been completely inhospitable and very difficult for humans to survive in those sort of circumstances. As we moved into the parts of the Holocene where we are now and things warmed up again, the dunes were vegetated, there was increasing rainfall, and it was possible once again for humans to occupy those sort of areas intermittently. And that's what happened. So it seems that the current Aboriginal inhabitants can probably date their occupation there to around about 4,000 years or so. My argument about, so the rock is such a spectacular and accessible feature that those first groups to arrive there 25,000 years ago must have climbed it to look at the environment they were around and survey for game, to keep an eye on opposition, opposing Aboriginal groups. So they definitely climbed it. On the rock itself are rock carvings high up on the rock and also at the Olgas, which are part of that Dreamtime story. So these were there prior to the Arnanu people arriving. In the 1930s, quite well-known anthropologist Charles Mountford spoke to Aboriginal people at the rock at the time, and many features about the summit were revealed to him. So we know from the anthropology that that they did go up there, and there are many summit features that are well documented. In the more recent period, we've got physical photographs of Aboriginal people on the rock. So we've got several expeditions in the 30s. In the 1940s, Aboriginal guides climbed with anthropologist Charles Mountford again, and he went up again in the 1950s. In 1946, and I'll show you this bit of footage at the end of the talk, a Lutheran pastor went on an expedition to Central Australia. So it was Lou Borgout was his name, and he filmed the whole thing. And the Lutheran archives have restored that footage, and it's available to view. And it's a really spectacular bit of history. And in that, he went to the summit with two Aboriginal men, Mitch and Jerry Mick, and a guy who really should have a statue at Ayers Rock, a bloke called Tiger Juckaleri. And Tiger was really the go-to person. If you wanted to visit Central Australia in the 40s, you went to Tiger and said, "Can we go and visit the rock?" And he would take you up to the summit. So we know that there's plenty of evidence of Aboriginal people climbing the rock. It's often said that the rock is a men's only place, but I've got a contact in Alice Springs by the name of David Hewitt, who worked in the Peterman Ranges for the west of Alice Springs, and in 1969 he went up with Aboriginal women on the rock. So it's not Aboriginal men, it's also women's, and this was the daughters of traditional elders. And if you're aware of, if you transgress, a woman was transgress a men's place in Aboriginal culture, it pretty much is a death sentence. So the fact that they went up there and they're still alive sort of indicates it wasn't a major deal in terms of access to the summit of the rock. And then in the 1970s, we've got Paddy Uluru himself, who was indifferent to people climbing. Tiger was very much a person who was at the campground and encouraged people to climb, but Paddy was quite indifferent to it. So this is a snapshot of a tourist guide that was produced in 1965. And you can see here just the amount of information about Aboriginal cultural stories around the rock itself. And there's plenty of sites on the summit. So there's lots of little arrows that point to features on the summit. So yeah, they definitely did climb the rock. Just to compare that with the modern guide. So this is what you get if you go there now. You get a blotchy image of the rock and you don't get any of this additional cultural information at all. The small circles you can see on that map are highlighted in the guide. So these are specific places they talk about, but there's a whole library of information that's missing from the modern, what Aboriginal people are willing to share these days compared to what they were willing to share in the 1950s through to the late 1970s. Also of interest in the 2019 images, those hatched areas where you're not supposed to take photographs. And there's a well-known Australian photographer who came up with a name of all the rules to describe the rules that all room, in terms of the photographic restrictions. So it's a bit over the top. The other thing that strikes me about the 2019 photo too is the location of the base walk. So people are encouraged these days to do the base walk. Up to the late 1970s, early 1980s, the base walk was a true walk around the base of the rock. You were very close to the base of it, you could touch it. On the northern rim these days, you're upwards of maybe a kilometre away from the actual rock. So it's a base walk of sorts, but you don't get to physically touch it. So it's really quite a difference in public access through the decades. And it's culminated in this ban on actually climbing Ayers Rock. These are a couple of the Aboriginal men who are key in just providing that indication that yes, they did climb and they weren't worried about it that much. So Tiger Jackalary there, this is a photo by Arthur Groom. So Arthur Groom, pretty well-known environmentalist, climbed in 1947 with Tiger and Tamalji, another Aboriginal man. This is a photo of them at what was then the summit camp. Tiger spent a lot of time at the rock, and up to his death, he basically would hang around the old campground. This is prior to Yalara being established. He used to be able to camp right up against the rock, and he used to encourage people to climb. So I just think there should be a statue to that man at the base of the rock, but there's no mention of these three guys in the current park official stories, even denying Paddy Allura a place, given that the rock's named after his family. So Paddy was interviewed a couple of times, in particular by the Alice Springs News, and he was always very indifferent about people climbing. And the statement there is one of the ones he said. So people are stupid enough to climb it, well, they're welcome to it. But the physical act of climbing was of no cultural interest to him and his group. His brother, Toby Naninga, he was actually a ranger at the rock, one of the first Aboriginal rangers employed by the then Northern Territory Conservation Commission. I managed to dig up some archival footage. This is This Day Tonight, the old ABC current affairs show. And at the time, they were talking about some of the environmental damage around the base of the rock and talking about the shift to moving the accommodation to Yalara and building the resort area. And Toby was interviewed and asked about his opinion about people climbing. And at the time, they had closed off public access to what's called Wariaki, which is the men's initiation cove. That was the real sensitive area for both Paddy and the other traditional male elders at the rock. So the ranger at the time, a guy called Derek Rofe, Greg, we'll put some barriers up and we'll stop people going through there. And Toby was interviewed as they're putting the fence posts up for that. I've got this on my YouTube channel, and the images of the guys putting the posts in is the sort of classic pre-OHS Australia, so they're wearing just shorts, thongs with mallets sticking in the holes. It's just classic sort of pre-nanny state Australia. But he said, yeah, look, aside from Wariaki, visitors are free to go anywhere they like, and he actually pointed to the camp at the top and gave that indication. So for the old men at the rock, the climb was never an issue. So yeah, that's that myth. We never climb. It's completely untrue. They did climb, and the fact that they're saying they currently don't climb is really complete ignorance of the history that's there. And it's just so sad that none of these guys are getting any recognition in any of the official literature at Ayers Rock. The second myth is that climbing's not safe. Now, if you've been to the Rock, you remember the plaques at the base. And that was used by Parks Australia as an indication of how dangerous this activity is. But you don't have to look very far to say, look, this is complete nonsense, right? So the Leyland brothers went there in 1977 and they photographed people climbing up the chain, including a couple of toddlers. In 1957, I think that is, through TAA and one of the tourist boards, they organised something called a petticoat safari. So this was to try and encourage solo women and women to actually venture out into Central Australia. And they had a group of about 20 women who were sponsored to do this. And this is a photograph from that Women's Weekly article of Mrs. Sarah Usnoff from Melbourne. Now, she was in her 80s and she sort of managed to get up there okay without sort of falling off. This is prior to the chain being in place as well. So, yeah, just on the face of it, just looking at how people are getting up and down the rock, it doesn't seem to make much rational sense that there's a major safety issue there. Looking at the actual numbers, though, so Parks Australia claim that there's been 37 deaths on the rock. And when I was putting together my book, A Guide to Climbing Ayers Rock, I asked them, so can you give me some details about where were they on the rock when they died, how old were they, and they refused to provide that information. I think partly because they just didn't have it. But at the time of when the closure was announced, the head ranger there, a guy called Mike Misso, gave an interview with Tim Webster on radio. And this is what his description of those 37 deaths was about. So he said, you look, over 30 people have known to have died from climbing, and they could have, I don't know, potentially climbed it, and they go to the resort and have a heart attack later. It's like, well, they could have had a really big steak and, 3 bottles of wine as well, So, so there's not really much evidence for those 37 deaths. In fact, when you look for corroboration, you look at newspaper articles and other sources, I came up with 18 deaths on the rock itself. And 6 of those were from falls. So there was 1 woman and 5 men, all adventurers, so they're all keen, under the age of 32. And then 12 were due to heart failure, mainly men. 1 was 44 and the rest were all over 52. So, okay, so there's been about 18 deaths we can confirm on the rock itself. There's only been 2 deaths this century, one in 2010 and one in 2018. The 2018 one was just prior to me taking my daughters there, so I was just worried that they would use that to close the whole thing down again, but they didn't, fortunately. At the same time, there's been 2 deaths this century at the Olgas. So you say, well, there's been deaths there, why aren't you closing that as well? So it just doesn't make much sense. The other thing about it, so they've been using this line for quite a long time. So when the federal government took over control of the rock in 85, and there was a handover process, the Northern Territory Conservation Commission lost control of it. One of the first things they did was to get legal inquiries done as to what their responsibilities are under duty of care. They were really worried about being sued. And the whole driver for the closure really comes from the bureaucrats back in Canberra being worried about their own asses. But being aware of that for so long, why haven't they, over the whole period, not taken any steps to reduce the risks? So there's been no attempts of doing, say, induction at the base, formal induction of the ranger, say, look, these are the risks, be careful when you go up there, stay close to the chain, whatever. They never did any of that. So they really weren't worried about the safety issue in that sort of sense. There's been no supervision in that time as well. So you do the rock and there's no rangers that come up with you, for instance. So to me, it sort of signifies that they really weren't that concerned with it. In fact, they were using safety as another excuse to try and close the thing down. If you go in a bit more detail and actually look at the risks, so how does the risk of climbing the rock compare to other activities? And you can use a unit of risk called a micromort. So a micromort is a unit of risk of 1 in a million. It's just a way of talking about it. And you apply those numbers, the risk in micromorts of the climb for people, and I say responsible climbers, so these are people who stayed on that main climbing route, didn't go venturing close to the edges and stuff like that, is a 0.2 of a micromort, so less than 1 chance in a million of dying for that group of people under 50. Looking at the older group, so the heart issue does come into it, and for them we're looking at around about 6.3 micromorts per climb, but overall the average is very low. So for comparable, so if the average risk is around 2 micromorts per climb. You get the same exposure by driving your car 800 kilometres, by riding a motorbike just 2 kilometres, by flying 3,000 kilometres, which is about the distance between Sydney and Ayers Rock. So the amount of risk you're exposing yourself just by flying is the same as you're doing by climbing the rock. So it just doesn't make much sense. By comparison, the climb up Mount Fuji, which takes about, there's quite a few people die on Mount Fuji each year, but it's about 15 micromorts. So something like Mount Fuji climbing is a much more greater risk. Your daily exposure, so there's the average risk across the community on any given day of 1 in 50,000 of you die. And obviously, if you're younger or older, your risks change, but on average, around about 1 in 50,000. So it's a very low risk activity, is what I'm saying. So the message about risk from Parks Australia really grossly and I think irresponsibly exaggerated, and they're just using it as a tool to as an excuse to close the activity down. And you'll see the same things happening at Mount Warning, at the Grampians. This issue of safety comes up, and they use that to close activities down. The third myth I want to talk about is this less than 20% want to climb, and that was the trigger that closed the climb officially. So in 2010, there were a couple of conditions put into the management plan, and one of them was that the climb will be permanently closed if the proportion of visitors climbing falls below 20%. So that was the trigger, and Parks Australia essentially engineered that closure. So in looking at the overall proportion of climbers, so there's been about 12 million visitors to Ayers Rock since the 1950s. I've estimated, just looking at the figures based on Parks Australia's own estimates, that around about 60% of people say climb. So it's not a huge figure. You know, a lot of people just, one, it's a physical activity they want to do and they'd rather go around the base. That's fine. So it wasn't a huge number to start with. To sort of provide some data that they could refer to, they installed climbing counters between 2011 and 2015. And that's a photograph of one of them installed on the chain. So it's basically just an infrared sensor. So if you walk past it, it would trigger a counter. The problem with it was if 2 people walked together on it, then it would just trigger 1 person. So there was issue way that these things were running, and they're estimated around about 30% underreporting using the climbing counters. When you look at the data, so on days when the climb was fully open, it was open from basically the time the parks opened in the morning, which is around about 8 o'clock up to about 4 o'clock, the percentage of people climbing was well and truly above 20%. So to me, it was a figure that was engineered by them. You'll notice there that there's all these gaps. So these are times when, it's too windy, it's too wet, there's forecast rain. There's a whole year there where they didn't open the climb fully for the whole day in 2014. So it was always partially closed. The thing about travelling to Ayers Rock and doing those activities, you've got a very limited schedule. So your plan is you want to do the climb in the morning because it's cooler. If it's closed, well, go do something else. And by the end of the day, you're back at the resort and you've missed your opportunity. So the numbers here just reflect, I think, that they never really reached that 20% in reality. It was something that they manufactured through these artificial closures. So they gamed the system. I tried to test this out myself. So when I went there in July 2018, I bought an exercise book, and I called it the Last Logbook. That's a photograph of it there. And I put that in a Tupperware container at the Cairn. And my daughters and I went off to Kings Canyon. We came back a couple of days later, did the climb again. And at that stage, there was already about 10 pages full of signatures. We left, and then I had a little note on the logbook. Once this is full, please return. And I had a self-addressed envelope in that box. And one of the rangers found it. It's about 10 metres or so from the Cairn, and they fortunately made it back to me. And when I got back, it was completely chockers. It was full, 196 pages full in just over a month. I went through, counted the signatures, so 2,400 signatures from 33 countries. So the oldest recorded, who actually put their age down, was an 83-year-old woman, and the youngest was basically being carried up by mum in a womb. So that's a couple of pages from it. So I just put this one up because it's got people from the Netherlands. There's Namibia, which is a really odd place to me for people to come to Australia from. France, China, Netherlands again. There's Wales, Germany, Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Caboolture, Queensland. And it just really highlighted to me, one, how important this is to Australia, but also to the rest of the world. This was an internationally renowned activity. So people came to Australia, to Central Australia, really just to climb. The original logbooks, so from around about 65 through to 85, there was a logbook, black logbook that was left at the summit. In 1970, when they built that beautiful cairn with the directional compass rose on the top in bronze, there was a shelf in there that they made especially so that there could be a visitor's logbook and people would write in that logbook. There's 171 logbooks in the archives in Alice Springs. And there was one visitor that I was really keen on seeing the signature for, and this is the Emperor of Japan, the current Emperor of Japan, Hirohito. So he climbed in the late 1970s with a part of a delegation from Japan. They came out and he really wanted to climb the rock. And I asked them to trace, I said, I don't know, it's this date. And they looked at the page and they actually photocopied that page and sent it to me. And there he is, his little signature. Naruhito with a date, and there's a whole list of dignitaries that went with him. As part of that, the Japanese government commissioned an artwork of Ayers Rock. It's a beautiful painting that's currently in the archives at the National Library. A beautiful painting, but it's just, in the back room covered in dust. It's just a terrible thing to see, just stored in the way it is stored. But so this was my own little experiment about people wanting to climb and where they were coming from. It was just a really beautiful record of that month of people climbing from all over the world. And it's just so sad that this thing's been taken away. So what's the impact? Okay, so we've closed this thing now since 26th of October 2019. Annual visits, so we went through that COVID period, so the numbers did drop during that period. But if you look at the average 5 years and you take just the period outside of COVID, the numbers are down by about 100,000 per annum. There's been a loss of awe and wonder and a sense of adventure. Those kids in that Leyland Brothers video, I'm sure, as young as they were, that really had an impact on them. So that sense of achievement that comes with doing something like that, and the added confidence that comes from it for young people, just completely lost. Costs, so we're looking at probably around about $500 million at the moment. So it's running at around about $100 million a year in lost earnings. And that's reflected in the struggling nature of the Yulara Resort. They're really struggling to make ends meet. There's been destruction of cultural artifacts. So as part of the heritage listing in the 80s, they talked about part of the heritage was the views you could see. And they meant the views from the summit. And that's been destroyed now. We can't go see those views anymore. The cairn itself was demolished. This was erected in 1970. The Rangers were involved in building it. Not only did it serve as that the summit of Ayers Rock, it was actually a memorial to the Australian Geodetic Survey. So the survey marker at the top of the rock formed part of that national survey that established Australia's place on the globe. There's another one at the Olgas. So this one, so underneath that cairn, it was drilled into it. A hole. In the hole was a roofing nail sitting on a 5-cent piece. And the point of that nail was what was measured in terms of finding the location of that spot. If I was to go out and destroy one of those survey markers, it would cost me $10,000. But Parks Australia went ahead and did that. So when they removed the cairn, they actually destroyed an important survey marker and they got away without paying anything for it. Other artifacts, so those memorial plaques, there was indication that they were going to try and trace the relatives. I don't know whether they actually did. And the chain itself. And the other thing that's been destroyed is cultural traditions and heritage. And it's not only our Western traditions or the Japanese tradition of climbing the mountain. It's those stories about the summit that were key to Aboriginal culture in the area. So if they're saying they no longer climb, what's happened to the stories about the summit? So that's gone as well. We've lost thousands of international tourists. In place of the climb, we've now got what I'd call a sideshow alley of attractions. one of the Aboriginal leaders there supporting the closure, a guy called Sammy Wilson, described the climb as Disneyland. It was a Disneyland experience, which is really an incredible insult to what it actually was. But in its place now, we have a drone show. You know, this is a drone show that's supposedly showing an Aboriginal cultural story. We've got a plastic light show, this desert lights thing, which is just, to me, just throwing rubbish into the desert. It's just awful. We've got the segways around the rock and other activities, which is supposed to replace what was once a fantastic, you know, free experience that you could go. So they've really done so much damage. We'll continue our fight to get that reopened. I think it's completely unsustainable in the future. To me, what's going to happen is those young Aboriginal men growing up at Moody Jewel are going to go overseas and see what they do overseas. And they'll come back and say, why can't we have this again? And I think it's ultimate. It's something that will reopen in some form down the track. Mount Warning. So those same three things, Aboriginal culture, safety, are apparent in the Mount Warning story. Environment's another one. The tourists are causing so much environmental damage, we need to close this down. So those key themes sort of go through most of these closures. I was going to tell you a little bit about Mount Warning, but I think Bill Peach can probably do it better, so hopefully. Trying to get some volume into this. Listen carefully. Okay.
Greetings from the morning of Australia.
Can you hear that?
This is the place where the morning sun first lights on the Australian continent. I'm standing on top of Mount Warning. It's 3,800 feet high, 20 miles inland from the Pacific, and it dominates this entire northeastern corner of New South Wales. Down here to the southeast, I can see Byron Bay and Cape Byron, the most easterly point on the Australian coast. Due east in front of us lies the Willumgar and the Tweed River Valley. And further north, along the coast, are Fingal Head, Tweed Heads, and Point Danger. Off the coast there in 1770, Captain Cook encountered dangerous shoals. He said mariners would always be able to know their position by this mountain, and so he called it Mount Warning. This mountain is actually a volcanic plug, the remains of the centre of a huge volcano which was active here 20 million years ago. That's the rim of it you can see over behind me. In fact, the activity of that volcano created the entire countryside around here. So let's look now at the land the volcano made. Around Mount Warning.
So that's Bill Peach. Yep. Peach's Australia 1975. You saw how white his shirt was. So it's a 4.5, or it's a 2.5 hour walk from the car park at Mount Warning to the summit. The elevation change is around about 700 metres, and somehow I think he got dropped off by a helicopter. There's no way you can keep your hair like that and keep your shirt clean as he did climbing the summit. So this is an aerial view of Mount Warning. So the summit itself sits right in the middle of that circle. When you look at the volcanic activity around Mount Warning, it extends a considerable distance from that what used to be the vent of the volcano. And so the circle itself is around about 80 kilometres in diameter. So it affected a huge part of northern New South Wales, southwest Queensland. So these lava flows came out of that central plug and flowed across the landscape. And in the 20 million years or so since that happened, a lot of that's been eroded away. In fact, when we look at how much has been eroded, so this is just a geological cross-section through the Mount Warning plug area. You've got the high point on the right-hand side of that, shows where that central vent was. And then you've got these very shallow lava flows that flowed out and covered a huge area. In the gap between what's called the caldera wall on the left, it's actually eroded all the way through to bedrock. So all that material has been eroded away. It's washed down the Tweed River and it's been deposited off the coast. So in terms of the geology, then it's really an important place for primary school, secondary school students and university people to go and understand that part of Australia's geological history. The type of volcano, so it's very similar to the sort of volcanoes you get in Hawaii. It's a shield volcano. So you get these massive effusions of basalt lava that flow a long way. It's got a very low viscosity, so it flows. And Australia, when Mount Warning was erupting, was sitting over a hot spot. So as our continental plate has been moving north, we progressed over that hot spot, and that same hotspot caused the structures in the Glasshouse Mountains, Mount Canobolas in New Bathurst, and there's a chain of volcanoes that go all the way down the coast and ends up around the Mount Gambier area. Whether it's the same hotspot or not, there'll be a discussion about whether it is or whether it stopped and started a little bit, but that's the tale of how that volcanic chain was deposited. So it's a really important place to understand the geology of northern New South Wales, but we can't go there anymore to look at it. It was a really popular spot for school groups. I just want to talk a little bit about the summit track history. And again, this is history that you don't get in the official guidebooks. So like a lot of geographic features in the country that were special, and people recognised these as potential tourist attractions, the local community around the Willem saw the future in this thing. If we can build a track to the summit, then more people will come. And in 1908, actually completed a summit track. You can sort of see this is a parish plan from 1908, and that red line is the 6-foot track working its way to the summit. And it was a really well-constructed trail. The photo there is from a visit I did in 2001, January, and it just shows you, how well constructed this walk was. So there's beautiful stone steps, beautiful stone retaining walls. This is the guys who did this worked on some of the railway lines that were being put in the 1890s around the area. They worked as volunteers. The Wollongbar Chamber of Commerce managed to get a grant from the New South Wales government to sort of fund this stuff, but most of the work was done by local volunteers. And to me, it looks like they really put their heart and soul in getting this thing. It's just so well constructed. The track now is well over 100 years old, and it has lasted through multiple cyclones, and it's still in really good condition. If you go to the summit, so if you follow that track near to the top, it's a very well graded track, so it's a very easy walk until you get to the last 200 metres or so. The last 200 metres or so is a rock scramble. And basically in the 1920s, the way to get up there was you'd ride most of the way and you'd leave your horse at the base of the rock scramble and you just did the rock scramble bit. In 1926, a couple of guys rode Indian motorcycles up there. There's reports that they had a few falls, but there were no injuries. So they did really well to get this. But that just gives an indication of how good the track was. It's a 6-foot track that you could get up in a motorcycle. Pretty amazing. School groups in the 1920s, so they actually donated it and made a plaque honouring Captain Cook, and that was placed at the summit in the 1920s. It's been lost to history. No one knows what happened to it. But it was done by school kids. So the school kids actually got those donations and funded this plaque to be put at the summit. And on there was just basically that excerpt from Cook's journal mentioning how he named Mount Warning. So The locals also saw the importance of preserving this area for the rest of Australia, and they petitioned the state government to reserve the area as a national park. And on the 3rd of August 1929, that was actually officially opened as a national park by Francis Boyce, who was the Attorney General of New South Wales at the time. So it was a very senior politician travelling from Sydney all the way to Murwillumbah to open the park. So it was a very special event. He was accompanied by his wife and a couple of other dignitaries. The local mayor attended. Those guys rode horses to near the top, and they were accompanied by about 200 other people, most of them school kids. And at the summit, Mr. Boyce dedicated the park to all Australians for eternity. So quite a significant moment in the history of the Murwillumbah area. So we've now got this beautiful national park that's been preserved for everyone forever. Through the 30s and into the 1960s, so basically a period of increasing tourism, increasing mobility of the Australian population through things like rail and motor car. In the 1930s, Mount Warning was described as Tweed's Eiffel Tower. Mount Warning, the sentinel of the north, and descriptions about climbing the summit, it was like a spiral staircase. There's no big dramas about climbing doing that last rock scramble. The school kids were doing it. This is prior to any sort of chain going up. In 1947, there was a proposal to put a light on the summit, a light of peace. This is sort of following World War II, and it was going to honour again Captain Cook, but it never got up. In 1966, so 67, we see the formation of the National Parks Authority in New South Wales, and ownership and control or management of the park was transferred to National Parks at that stage. And that sort of marks a little bit of a change in management. One of the good things about that was they actually funded National Parks and Wildlife Service New South Wales funded and established their own unit of anthropologists to go out across New South Wales and interview Aboriginal elders about their mythology, about the parts of the country that were special to them. Where don't you want people to go? One of the key figures for Mount Warning is a lady called Millie Boyd. It's a photo over there. So she was designated as the last school gun or the last keeper of the stories about the mountain. So along with her, Harry interviewed other Aboriginal elders. They found there were no sacred sites at the summit or near the summit trail. And talking with Harry just in the last couple of years, he said that he could confirm that he never heard them talk about the summit being closed to the public. It just wasn't on their radar. 75, one of that great documentary by Bill Peach. So the other parts of that documentary that he did look at local family groups around Murwillumbah and some of the features, the loss of some of the rainforests and stuff like that. But Millie's a really key figure. So she died in the mid-90s. There was quite a long obituary in the Koori Mail, just highlighting how important she was to the local community. In 1985, the first management plan gets done, and there's no record of Aboriginal sites in the Mount Warning National Park. So this is after Harry's pretty extensive anthropological work. There's no Aboriginal sacred sites in the park. In 1989, so the very clear grassed area you saw with Bill Peach standing on it, that was getting eroded by the foot traffic. So they decided to put some formal lookouts at the summit. So 1989, a guy called Steve Gorell designed the summit lookouts that are there now, and they went up. National Parks were so pleased with their work. In 1993, they released a beautiful, glossy little pamphlet. And in that, it went into flora and fauna, geology, Aboriginal history, European history. In terms of the climb, they called it the staircase to the sky. And they mentioned in there, in terms of people climbing, age does not appear to be a barrier for those who attempt to climb. Children as young as 5 have reached the summit unaided. Likewise, people in their 80s also successful. A reasonable degree of fitness and a determined attitude would be seen to be the necessary criteria. So pretty much, anyone can do it. It's pretty much a basic thing. And it's something that was celebrated within national parks. In 1997, so they actually redid parts of that track. The man in the photo is a guy called Matt Murphy. I've been speaking with him over this period. So he was an ex-ranger in the park. The work they did was to set a formal chain. So there was an ad hoc chain that was in place in the 1970s, actually formalised that system with a properly designed chain. They built a corral area, or a seating area where the horses used to be, and they redid parts of the track. And he worked with local Aboriginal people were involved in doing that work with him. If you went to the early parts of the internet, so 1998, National Parks described the climb. Mount Warning offers a fantastic walk, rainforest at the bottom, a steep climb, and dazzling views at the top. So really, it was a great thing to do. But trouble was coming, and it emerged in late 1999. So as part of celebrating the millennium, National Parks and Wildlife Service had a billet of 60 tickets to see the first sunrise of the new millennium. So it was a pretty big event for them. On the cusp of that happening, an Aboriginal bloke from outside the area, from Grafton, stood up and said, "No, we don't want people climbing. It's a men's initiation area." Now, National Parks had already organised through the Tweed Byron Land Council. They had authorisation to go ahead with the climb, and there were no issues with it. And there were a lot of Aboriginal elders who spoke up about this proposed protest, which in the end didn't go ahead. One of them was a man called Fletcher Roberts. He's a Widgeable elder, and he very clearly pointed out that they've been doing the climb for decades, and the claim that has arisen that it's a men's initiation site is a modern day invention. So that's what he said. One of the other things that I was really taken by was this press release he did just in 2000, the days after that this controversy sort of arose. Is this statement: the white community needs to wise up to the Aboriginal sectors that try to use their lack of understanding of Aboriginal culture for their own purposes. I think if we paid more attention to what Fletcher was saying back then, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. It's not unusual for clans to have disputes on the boundaries, and this still happens today as it did in the past. But for people from near Grafton to claim that they have any jurisdiction over Mount Warning is too far a stretch of the imagination. So the Aboriginal elders at the time called this out, but they weren't listened to. So National Parks got sucked in by this modern day invention. So they got together with the group of people who wanted the climb closed, and they formed a group called the Wollongong Consultative Group. And they became the sole source of information that National Parks used to manage Aboriginal issues, not only in Mount Warning National Park, but in the other national parks in New South Wales. So Millie Boyd and the work of anthropologist Harry Creamer were completely discarded. It's just really shameful, the approach they've taken to particularly Millie Boyd's family throughout this whole saga. This is a photo of Marlene Boyd. This is Millie's daughter, and she fought tooth and nail to oppose this Bundjalung takeover that was happening in the park. So in 2006, similar to Ayers Rock, a sign appeared at the base of the Mount Warning climb that said, under Bundjalung law, only specific chosen people are allowed to climb, and we'd rather you don't do it. And this was the first step in that process. So we had that happen at Uluru, at Ayers Rock. This sign comes up saying we don't want you to climb. It was started in 2006 at Mount Warning. And this Bundjalung Nation basically is a very politically savvy group of people exercising their political power. And they ran roughshod over the Boyd family. So Marlene, just before she died, gave an interview with the Daily Mail, the photo of the article there. She said, one of the things in that article she talks about is this Bundjalung take, this illegitimate Bundjalung claims on the area. It does not accord with the history that they knew. But she said in terms of the climb, she said, I do not oppose public climbing of Mount Warning. How can the public experience the spiritual significance of this land if they do not climb the summit and witness creation? When I first read that, I was just so struck by how universal that statement is. It's just a universal statement of human values. This is what we all feel when we climb mountains, we climb up there to look at that wonderful countryside, appreciate it, and the reason we appreciate it, we then protect it for future generations. She said, much of my ancestral law and history have been stolen and abused. She said that the current master plan recognised their ownership, but then she's never been asked to participate. And that's true to this day. So the Rackwell group, led by the Boyd family, have been ignored by national parks. So moving on, So one of the things I did early in January 2021 was to put a Freedom of Information request in for documents relating to Mount Warning. I got some documents. I also asked for the minutes of the meetings between national parks and this Wollumba Consultative Group, and I was denied access to those. So the Freedom of Information laws in New South Wales exclude consultations with Aboriginal groups. So they're basically something that's going to remain a state secret. But late last year, working with John Ruddock, who's a Libertarian MLC, they actually were able to, through the parliamentary FOI process, so as a parliamentarian, the rules are a little bit different, so they managed to get hold of some of these documents. And these really reveal a history of obstruction, of confusion, of changing attitudes, and I'll just go through some of the key points. So I mentioned those dry stone walls and the stairs. So national parks themselves recognised that they were items of European heritage, and they discussed it with the WCG, this Wollumba Consultative Group. And that group said, well, look, if that's listed as heritage, it's just going to make it harder to close the climb. So it never was listed as heritage. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is actually going through the process of listing those walls and stairs as heritage structures. It's going to be interesting to see what happens as that process plays through, because national parks themselves tried to do it at one time. But were blocked by this WCG group in 2012. So, denying permission for mobile kiosks to set up in the park. They proposed an entry fee. If we can't stop them climbing, make the fee so high. In the early 2013, Cyclone Debbie went through, a lot of damage to the track. National parks didn't quite repair the track to the same standard. So yeah, the track it's not the same standard. So that beautiful 6-foot track, it's now much narrower, single track. A lot of the fines and the gravels are washed away. So there's a lot of areas where you're walking on rounded boulders, and no surprise, there's been an increase in injuries, mainly ankle sprains and things like that. And it's because national park zone maintenance isn't the standard. An important event was in August 2014. So the area above 600-metre contour in the park was declared an Aboriginal place. That's important. We'll come back to it later. Through 2014 and 2019, it's one of the weirdest things about this whole story. National parks engage and pay tourism academics from Southern Cross University to develop a demarketing plan for the park. Now, how can we reduce the numbers? How can we make it less significant? This is just completely over the top. It's just, how can a country allow this to happen? Here's this massive, beautiful tourist attraction that people come from overseas to attend, and we want to turn people away from it. So they actually paid for this study. As part of the study, they engaged one of the graduate students, went to the entrance to the climb and was surveying people about why you're climbing, did you get to the summit or not? When you consider the sign, the Bundjalung sign, you're still going to climb, and most people did. One of the things about that survey is they mentioned the Bundjalung story, but they say nothing about the Narrackroll views. What would those views be if you got, faced with Marlene's beautiful statement about climbing? So they didn't ask those questions. It was all about the Bundjalung. Oddly enough, it had no impact on visitor numbers. The visitor numbers just grew through that period. But it's just really bizarre that they would actually try and do something like that. Well, we're going to see similar things happen, for instance, at the Great Barrier Reef. Tourists are damaging the reef. We've got to take the tourists away. We just keep shooting ourselves in the foot with this. So going back to those minutes, so in 2016, they recognised that there were an increase in numbers of people, and they actually proposed at that stage, it's 2016, to introduce a fee and permit system for climbing. And that probably would have been a suitable compromise. These sorts of systems are being introduced overseas. So if you go to Hawaii and climb the Waikiki crater, for instance, tourists need to log online and make a booking, and it costs $5. If you're a local, you don't have to pay. There's a national park in Utah called Zion National Park, and there's an attraction there called Angel's Landing. And part of that walk to Angel's Landing involves a narrow walk along a very narrow rock ridge, which is supported by a chain. And the numbers are huge. And in order to control those numbers, US national parks have introduced, again, a fee and permit system just to try and keep in control and manage the crowds. So I don't really have a problem with this approach, but they actually endorsed it, but after the planned closure of Ayers Rock was announced, they didn't follow through, and neither did national parks. And the whole attitude of this group changes significantly after the Ayers Rock closure. So in 2019, suddenly they want the mountain to be closed. We want custody of the mountain. We want to own the mountain. We want national parks to tell us how we can do it, and they will want to work with national parks to develop a strategy for closure. August meeting, find out what strategies were employed for Uluru. So they were planning very much with national parks to go through and follow that planned closure period. But in March 2020, COVID hit, and all the national parks in New South Wales got closed. So I got sent this. This was a bit of paper that was left on the windscreen of the last person to walk out legally of Mount Warning. So they were closed today. Can you please lock the? We can't be bothered being here, but can you close the gate on your way out? Thank you. So yeah, turn the lights on the way out. And then I'll just take you through a bit of a summary of the last 5 years. So it's now over 5 years of that temporary closures. They call it a temporary closure. So we've had 6 monthly closures for the first 3 years. So, ban closure, we'll tell you what's happening 6 months down the track. That's currently been extended to the end of this year. In terms of the reasons for the closure, so it moved from just COVID to safety reasons. So in that period of time, they actually had removed the summit chain. So they had an engineer go and inspect the chains. Oh, yeah, I agree with you. There's a problem with the footings. Well, it's not safe. So I'm an engineering geologist. So I actually wrote to the engineer and said, can you give me your report? Can I have a look at it? And he did. He gave me the report. And his assumptions about, one, the way the chain was constructed were completely flawed. His problem was the way that those posts were put in. There was a steel plate welded to a circular bit of steel that was embedded in the rock surface with a couple of bolts going through. And then on that was another matching plate and polished. So his issue was that because he couldn't inspect the weld that was hidden by the rock, he couldn't guarantee the safety of the system. And there are ways to look at that. You could drill a hole through, or you put a scope in. You can just sufficiently look for corrosion, signs of deep corrosion on the surface plate, and there's none there. This is all very light corrosion. So he was completely wrong. The way he assessed the consequences of people, that were to fail when people are walking up. So because the chain's connected to multiple posts, there's in the system, you need multiple posts to fail for someone to have a significant injury. So the only link they're failing is the slack to the next post. So he took none of that into account. But National Parks, well, they've got their expert now. They've got their expert opinion. The expert says the chain's bad, and they actually took it out in secret. That was in August 2020. I was writing to them at the end of 2020 and conversing with the engineer who was unaware that they'd removed it. And one of the main reasons I first went up there was to see what the chain was like. When I got to the summit, it had already been ripped out. So they lied to me about the chain still being there. It's just crazy. So the safety claims about the chain were wrong. A lot of people don't use the chain to get up there. A long history of the chain not even being there when school kids were climbing up. The rest of the track is a very gentle, well-graded track. And if they actually had maintained that properly, there wouldn't be an issue with any injuries. The sorts of injuries we're talking about are really minor ankle sprains and that sort of thing. There's been 2 people killed or died on Mount Warning, one in 2016. So it was an American backpacker that got struck by lightning while camping at the summit in a thunderstorm. So perhaps not really the best place to pitch a tent. And an 80-year-old woman died in 2018 just on the lower part of the track, about a kilometre from the car park from a heart attack. So two deaths. Now, the Aboriginal cultural claims, so we're told that it's culturally unsafe to climb. It's just culturally unsafe. I don't know really what that means. So those claims remain highly contested. National parks continue to refuse to acknowledge the Wracked claims on the mountain. So the minutes in that go to 2024. So a fellow called Sturt Boyd, who's Millie's grandson, applied to get on the Willamette Consultative Group and was denied because he would be a troublemaker. So there's this family with the closest connection to the mountain, and the guy can't get on the board. So they've refused also to work with their former anthropologist, Harry Boyd. They don't want to work with him either. The FOI I spoke about, so they revealed plans to close the summit in November 2022. And that's what really started that social media and community protest campaign. So we've got a couple of Facebook pages around it. Mount Warning Facebook, reopen Mount Warning Facebook page that's currently got 6,500 members, and there's frequent posts on that. A lot of them involving people actually with photos of the climb they've just done. So there's a lot of people climbing illegally. We've had numerous protest climbs, most notably Australia Day. So we like using Australia Day as our protest day for Mount Warning, just to sort of say this is something that belongs to the whole country. So we've done protests in 2023, 2024, 2025. I'll show you some photos of the one in 2024. That was quite a special one. And it just getting worse in a way. So in October 2022, the Liberal government announced plans that they would be handing over the entire national parks estate in New South Wales to Aboriginal groups and then renting it back. So it's this Uluru Ayers Rock model. So what they're planning on doing is finding the local land council that's responsible, striking a lease arrangement with them. Management would be by a board that is majority Aboriginal controlled. So it's essentially cutting the public out of any sort of management or stake in those national parks. So that's the plan for every park in New South Wales. I'm not sure what they're going to do when they get to something like the Sydney Harbour National Park. That's going to be an interesting one. They've already handed over things like Goat Island in Sydney Harbour. So these things are happening. So yeah, and the weird thing was announced by the Liberals on this. Weren't you the people? Aren't you supposed to be backing Australia as a unified, undivided nation? But no, it seems to be they're happy for their bureaucrats and this woke bureaucracy run the show. So that Aboriginal place, so they needed a management plan for that. So that was released in 2022. I cover it a bit in my book, but it is just a plan based on myth, superstition, and sorcery. So the plan basically says there'll be no public access to Mount Warning at all. We want to expand that Aboriginal place to encompass the whole of the park and adjoining areas which we see are connected to Mount Warning. And this included ridge lines tens of kilometres outside the park, which had views of the Mount Warning area. So because that ridge line you had a view and there was, say, a transmission tower or something like that on it, we should have some say in what goes on those areas completely outside the park. So it talked about it being a men-only site, so if women go up there, they'll get sick. If men go up there who are uninitiated, they'll have problems. They'll fall over and die or something. So it's based on old school Stone Age myth and superstition. And that's what their national parks are now planning to use to manage the park. It's just crazy. So I'm currently the president of the Save Our Summits group. So they were established in response to planned closures of the Glasshouse Mountains. So we're sort of trying to keep that alive. We had some good luck this year with the change of government in Queensland actually resulted in a positive response to our calls for the mountain to preserve for public access. So that one worked, except we're still trying to get that into a management plan. So it's actually written down. We celebrated the 95th anniversary of that park opening last August, and we actually, I won't say I dragged him up, but I pretty much did. So John Ruddock, Libertarian Party MLC in the New South Wales Upper House, climbed with us and attended our community protests. We've had 2 parliamentary petitions. The second had over 10,000 signatures and triggered a parliamentary debate. Sadly, we only had 3 speakers. John Ruddock spoke, Minister Penny Wong spoke, and the Greens spoke. Penny Wong just kicked the can down the road, so we've got to make a decision. We've still got lots of stakeholder engagement to do. The Greens said, well, it's an Aboriginal issue and we don't really have any right to be talking about it at all. And John, stood up and defended the public right to climb. Bizarrely, National Parks spent over $20,000 in security guards. So there was a period there when they reopened part of the park, the Lyrebird track, which is a very short walk near the car park. And they were worried about people climbing to the summit. They actually erected a fence across the entrance to the track. And they engaged security guards to patrol that. And they spent $200,000 in security guards. Now, the cost to actually probably repair the track to a standard where you get tourists up there is probably around about $200,000. So the National Park have just wasted that money. The public have continued to ignore that closure and they're still climbing. At least 2 people I'm aware have been fined and I'm one of them. So that's sort of where we are at the moment. A bit of media coverage there. That was the 2003 Australia Day climb. There was a request there from Sturt Boyd, who's Millie's grandson, for them to play a recording of Millie singing her song about the mountain from the summit, and these guys fulfilled that request for him. This was it's a photo of Sturt there on the bottom left of the screen with one of our SOS members, and that's him with the sun behind him. When he got up there, actually sang his grandmother's song from the summit. So it was really quite a special experience for him to be up there. It was the first time he's been up there. It's quite amazing. I carried the Australian flag up there. I said, Sturt, do you mind me putting this up? He said, no, brother, go ahead. So we had a great Australia Day in 2024. There's a photo of John Roddick and myself there in Libertarian regalia as well. So we've been, really keeping the pressure on the state government to try and get this thing reopened. And I moved from periods of sort of optimism and pessimism about whether or not we're going to have success with it. In terms of the impact, so over 500,000 visitors at least have been denied access to all wonder and that sense of adventure, including a hell of a lot of school groups. The cost of the closure, so local economy, probably about $5 or $6 million a year. Overall, probably about $15 million a year. It was an activity that you could do just by driving to. It's nearby the Gold Coast, not far away. So looking at overall costs now around about $75 million. The lookouts, the track, and those beautiful retaining walls under threat. So as part of that Aboriginal Place Management Plan, they're talking about removing European culture from the mountain. I'm not sure how they're going to excavate those walking tracks out there. Bizarre. Cultural genocide. So this whole Ngunnawal mythology. So the Ngunnawal have their own mythology about the mountains. It's not expressed in the current Aboriginal Place Management Plan. They've been completely ignored. Mount Warning for them is the bush turkey. If you look at Mount Warning from the north, the profile looks very much like a bush turkey. So for them, it's an increased site where people didn't hunt the brush turkeys and they would increase their numbers. So no one really went there. So that culture has just been completely buried by national parks. It's just not in the current Aboriginal Place Management Plan. So we've had that loss of international tourists. National parks said, oh, okay, we'll close the climb, but we're going to give you this new walk, right? This is this Tweed Hinterland Walk, which has been renamed Gidjum Gulgunji. So it's about 40 kilometres long. The national parks have put in about 4 camping stations, but it's going to cost you if you want to camp overnight at those places. The cost is for 2 people, it's $172. If you just use solo, it's still $172. For a family of 5, it would set them back $516. So not really taking into account cost of living pressure or anything like that, and the idea that national parks are there for everyone and the cost should be minimal. At this stage, based on those minutes, it appears national parks are moving to hand over the park as freehold to this Wollongong consultant, and it will be managed by that Aboriginal Place Management Plan. That's where it looks like it's going. So we're doing our best to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's Mount Warning. I'll just briefly go through Grampians and Arapiles. When Robert first proposed this talk, I was talking with Mike Tompkins, who's the president of the Australian Climbing Association Victoria branch, and he's been very much involved in this Grampians and Mount Arapiles issues. I was hoping Mike could sort of give a presentation on that tonight. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a sense of what's going on. Simon Carter is a wonderful rock climbing photographer. He's got a beautiful series of rock climbing photos that gives just a bit of a sense of the adventure that people experience when they get climbing in the Grampians and these places. It's not for everyone, but it should be open for those who want to do it. So Mike and Simon run a website, so grampiansclimbing.org, and I recommend they've got heaps of information on there about the closures that are going on in the Grampians and Arapiles and the reasons behind it. The reasons really stem from Victorian Aboriginal heritage legislation and the way that interacts with other parts of the parks legislation and the rest of it. So because we've got these sites and any Aboriginal site, apparently it doesn't matter how poor it looks or the standard, it's regarded as being sacrosanct. So the main issue for climbers in the Grampians and also Arapiles are evidence of quarrying. So Aboriginals in the area used to chip the stones off and use that to manufacture tools, and you'll find this evidence scattered around the base of these climbs. And because that's there, national parks have designated an area, and it's quite a big area at the base. So you've got something like that, which the climbing community, I think you're aware that they're the greenest bunch of idiots around, right? So they want to save the environment. They don't want to step on anyone's toes. All they want to do is just climb the rock face. So in an area like this, they'd be more than willing to okay, well, we did have a route up there, but we'll step away from this. But what they've done is actually blanket ban, tens of meters adjacent to these zones. The rock itself, so the Grampians sandstone is a very hard quartzite. It's very hard, and that's why they use these stone chips. We're utilising that strength of that rock to make these stone tools. So the idea that a soft-footed mammal is going to damage this in any way is a little bit over the top. In fact, climbing in the Grampians has been going on for decades, and there's no evidence anywhere to suggest that climbers have done any damage at all to these sort of things. So at the moment, about 70% of what was once open to the climbers has been closed at the Grampians. National parks are getting, again, parks authorities just using lies and information to come up with this sort of tale the climbers are doing damage. So this was a photo. If you see that dot just in there, that's actually a rusty bolt. And National Parks Victoria said, oh, this is something that the climbers have done. This is a bit of Aboriginal artwork. And you put a rock bolt right next to this bit of Aboriginal artwork. How dare you? Turns out that this is a rusted bolt from a cage that previous parks authorities had over the actual artwork. So they've done this themselves, and they were trying to blame the climbers for it. In the few sites, so a lot of the climbing, so you've got what's called traditional rock climbing, and you've got sport climbing. Traditional climbing is where climbers are putting in their own protection as they're going up. And as the person's coming up behind, they're removing that protection. So they don't leave anything on the rock face. The other type of climbing is sport climbing, where you've actually got anchors that are pre-installed, and for their safety, climbers will clip into those anchors. So they're permanently fixed to the rock. Most of the climbing in the Grampians and Arapiles is traditional. So there's very little interference with the rock face. The other purported damage is due to chalk. So climbers use chalk to increase grip. So there's quite often you get complaints about chalk marks on some of the rock faces. So the climbers have said, oh, look, we can use coloured chalk. You won't see it. So there's solutions to these things. This is just a snapshot of the main rock face at Arapiles. This is something called the Tiger Wall. It's very famous among the rock climbing community in Australia and internationally. People will come from overseas to climb for weeks in the Grampians and Arapiles. This is that whole face is banned. And the reason it's been banned is principally because of these rock chips at the base. So they found a couple of rock chips and they said, well, this entire rock face is now banned from climbing. In the photo, you can see the little arrow. It's the only bit of actual Aboriginal art in this photo. There's a couple of small emu feet that are tucked underneath the boulder in front. And those paintings are so degraded that they needed special cameras in order to image them. So it's not like we're talking Kakadu style artwork here in Arapiles. This is quite degraded. But at the same time, given decades of climbers being in the area, there's been no damage by the climbing community to any of this stuff. So it just doesn't make sense to the climbers that we've been there for forever. We're actually protecting and preserving the environment. We've got all these sites that we told Parks Victoria about, and now you're banning us from access. So I'll just a bit of the news reporting that's going on at the moment. I think at the moment there's still ongoing negotiations about some of the access issues, but it's looking like the government in Victoria are going to stand firm. So the bans that they've proposed will go ahead. Similar to the public's reaction or the bushwalkers' reaction at Mount Warning, there's been a lot of climbers climbing illegally and risking being fined for exercising their own cultural heritage. So I'll just end with this. So look, to me, when we unearth the history that has been hidden, the position of authorities in the situation is just simply founded on lies, misrepresentations, and the denial of historical truths. And they need to take a ride on that time machine and go back and really look at this and take into account that wonderful history that they've hidden. The access closures themselves are an attack on Australian values, on our cultural heritage, and our beliefs and practices. And it's not so much the Aboriginal people that are doing it, it's government bureaucracies that are really responsible behind this. At Ayers Rock, there was nothing wrong with the climb up until Parks Australia took control. At Mount Warning, we had clear indications from the Aboriginal community themselves that these claims were false. They were a modern day invention, yet national parks got sucked in and went down that route. So it really is a problem with our bureaucrats. They are basically indoctrinated with this grievance culture, this grievance industry, and the whole thing's riddled with race politics. It's come at a great economic cost. So well over $100 million a year is lost in tourism. We're not an economy anymore that makes anything. We're basically the world's quarry. And tourism is the next thing we seem to do well at one stage, but we're just shooting ourselves in the foot by closing these things down. It's dividing the country on racial grounds, and to me is an Australian version of apartheid. We're dividing parts of the country up, which used to be public land, and saying, well, you can go there if you're a particular racial group. The really sad thing are these lost experiences of nature. What I really feel for school kids who are not getting exposed to this at a young age. It's really key, I think, in helping people appreciate and preserve these places. If they're not aware of them, they're not exposed to them, they're not going to care about them. So it's only going to result in disaster down the track. The answer, I think it is really key that we need heritage legislation to be changed so that it recognises that we've all got a stake in this country. So that's where I want to. At the moment, if you haven't voted, so Jacinta Price was at Arapiles this week and promoting the coalition's plan to actually do a major review of cultural heritage legislation at a federal level. It's a bit of an issue between state and federal control over national parks. So we call them national parks, but they're actually state parks. So they're managed by the states. So there's an issue there. There is some of the federal heritage legislation which overrides the state legislation. It's what happened with the Blaney gold mine in central New South Wales. I remember that one. So the mine was approved to go ahead by the state government of New South Wales. The last minute, a new Aboriginal group showed up with a new mythology, the banded bee, and Tanya Plibersek decided that she believed that story, and they closed this mine, which was going to bring in $100 million of royalties a year to New South Wales. It's something like we don't need them up. So I think that's the key to this, is getting fixing the legislation. Legislation's broken at the moment. We're not going to get change unless that happens. So, thank you for listening. Just quickly do a bit of promotion before Robert gets up. So just in terms of further information, I've got the two books I've got are published by Connor Court. So you can go to Connor Court and order those. I was going to give these to Robert and the English speaking union just as thanks for their support. A couple of websites. So there's my Right to Climb blog, which I still write at regularly. There's saveoursummits.org, the Save Grampians climbing group. A new group's come up called Australian Recreation Union. They're looking at tackling this and trying to unify all these little groups across the country who are fighting these access issues. There's many of them. Facebook, we've got Reopen Mount Warning, Save Our Summits, and yeah, please visit the Australian Climbing Association Victoria site. So thank you again for listening.
Absolutely. I'll note at this point that we have been recording Marc's presentation, but we'll cease recording now and we'll open the remaining period for questions. So if anybody wishes